If Cryptic won't give us more Odyssey-class starships, then I will do it myself. With this build. I'm calling this one Stu's Oops All Odysseys build. Remember that meme? Yeah, the idea is to spawn as many Odyssey-class ships as I can. So let's take a look at how I did that. So the idea here is to create as many Odyssey-class ships as I possibly can. So obviously I'm going to be flying this on an Odyssey-class. I'm using the Lexington because, well, it's my favorite. It has the best bridge officer seating for an energy weapon build compared to any of the other Odysseys. It's a miracle worker, so that extra console slot means this thing is already very engineering heavy in the consoles than it already is. So it's a perfect candidate for isomag consoles. Plus in this case, the Barclay maneuver is going to feed further into our theme of creating more Odysseys. It's also a dreadnought. I do love dreadnoughts because we get a spinal lance and a hangar bay. Honestly, the only flaw this ship has is its 4-4 weapons layout. God, what I would give for this thing to have a 5-3. You know, I say that, but I really don't have much to give, so it's kind of an empty statement. Anyway, if this setup looks at all familiar, that's because this build actually started life as my broadside fire at will build, which I did a video for a couple months ago. And that's kind of the nice thing about this theme. Honestly, you could really just put it on anything. I am still running this as a broadside fire at will build, but you could run this on a beam overload build, a scatter volley build, a rapid fire build, anything as long as you have room for certain starship traits and consoles. So because of that, I'm actually not going to be going over most of this gear because, like I said, this started life as my broadside fire at will build, and it really hasn't changed all that much. If you want a more in-depth look of what I'm using everywhere else, then I would suggest going back and looking at that video. The only differences between this build and that original broadside fire at will build, besides the thematic changes I've made for this one, are that someone gave me a Constitution 3 a bit after that, and now I have access to the narrow angle phaser beam arrays. So let's talk about what I've done to give myself the ability to spawn in more Odyssey-class starships. One of the big necessities of this build is going to be the Flagship Distress Frequency Transponder. This was an event reward from earlier this year, and with it equipped, it will summon in a flagship every time you use the ability Fleet Support. Fleet Support is where most of our additional Odyssey-class ships are going to be coming from, so that means we're going to have to further buff that Captain's ability. But before we get to that, let's go through the rest of the gear I used for this. Now, for consoles, there really wasn't that much available that either summons in an Odyssey-class ship or summons in some sort of copy of the ship costume that I'm using. There's Voth Phase Decoy, which makes a holographic copy of your ship while cloaking your own. But while this is active, you are cloaked, so you're not able to fight while it's active, and honestly I found it more annoying to use than anything else, so I went without it. Photonic Displacer functions pretty much the same way, so again, I didn't bother with this. There's also Warp Burst Capacitor, which this is basically the old Picard maneuver console. It does technically make a copy of your ship, but it only sits there for 5 seconds and it doesn't do anything, so again, I didn't feel like this one was worth keeping. So since the consoles had so little to offer for the theme of this build, I decided to look at them from a new direction, instead looking for consoles that would buff the Odyssey-class ships that I'm wanting to spawn in. My first thought was of the Harmonic Yield Distribution via Radial Aperture console, which comes off of the Hydra Intel Destroyer. Now, when you activate this thing, it's supposed to teleport all of your pets near you. That includes hangar pets and separated ship sections, and I thought it would also include allied ships that you summon in. Because allied NPC ships tend to move very slowly, so the ability to teleport them from one side of a map to another using a console would actually be very valuable. The problem is, though, that effect doesn't really work on these. At least I haven't seen it work on any of the Odysseys. Though I have seen it work on the Kobayashi Maru, as well as some of the other ships that are spawned in with fleet support. But even then, they don't always work. So I'm not sure if I'm running into some sort of range or capacity limit, because I do also have a hangar bay on this ship, so if there's a capacity limit, that could certainly explain some things. It's just weird to me that this effect works on some pets, but not all pets, even though all those pets are all just NPC ships. It's very odd, but I still managed to get some pretty decent performance out of the console, so I kept it on. The other one is Sensor Suspension Burst off the Jarok Alliance carrier. This can be used to buff the crit chance of any hangar pets or any summoned-in ships within 20 kilometers. So any of those Odysseys within range are going to get a 30% crit chance buff for 20 seconds whenever I activate this. Another console I would have liked to be able to add is Power Transfer Emitters off the Friendship Command Flight Deck carrier. Though this console is more useful for buffing your hangar pets rather than summoned-in pets, it could still be used on them to add even more crit chance as well as some electrical damage. Moving on to the personal space traits, again, there really wasn't much available here to add to the theme. Most of these are just my usual energy weapon setups, so I'm not going to go over them here, but I will list them on the screen for you. Though, as stated earlier, I do go into more detail on that original broadside build video. So you might want to check that out too if you haven't seen it already. Though there are 2 traits that I want to talk about that are going to be pretty vital to this theme. Since the captain's ability Fleet Support is going to be playing such an important role on this build, we want to be able to reduce its cooldown as much as possible. That way we can trigger the ability that much more often. The first trait is one I've used on a lot of different builds, Intelligence Agent Attaché. With this, every time I score a critical hit with my weapons, this will lower the cooldown of my captain's abilities a little bit, which includes Fleet Support. I'm also using the personal trait Friends in Unusual Places, which will further lower the cooldown of Fleet Support by 33%. With these two personal traits, I am able to consistently get Fleet Support down to its minimal cooldown, meaning I'm able to activate the ability as much as I possibly can, and thereby maximizing the number of other Odyssey-class ships I can spawn in. Now, moving on to the starship traits, these first two are actually just here just because this is still an energy weapon build. First is Emergency Weapon Cycle to buff my Fiery Cycle haste and lower my weapon power cost, and the other is Entwined Tactical Matrices, which I'm using to keep Fire at Will up 100% of the time. Of course, if you're wanting to use a different firing mode, then you'd want to swap this out for whatever starship trait that extends that firing mode that you want to use. Now, the rest of these starship traits are really where the thematic elements of this build really come into play. So, normally Fleet Support has a restriction on it that you cannot activate the ability unless your hull is at 50% or less. But with the starship trait Command Frequency, that restriction is removed, so you'll be able to activate it whenever you're in combat. Now, there are 3 different versions of the Command Frequency starship trait. There's the base one, then there's Improved Command Frequency, and this one, Superior Command Frequency. The base version removes the hull restrictions from Fleet Support, and the improved version will lower its cooldown by 10 minutes. Both of these are unlocked by leveling the Command Officer Specialization Skills track. So when you get to Tier 4 in Command, you'll unlock the base version, and when you complete the whole thing, you'll get the improved version. The Superior version will do all of that, plus it will add an allied frigate to the summon for Fleet Support. Normally, Fleet Support 3 only summons in a single battleship, but with Superior Command Frequency, you'll also get a frigate along with that, and because we got the Flagship Distress Frequency transponder in the devices, we'll also get a flagship along with that, meaning Fleet Support will be summoning in 3 different ships, and that's for every activation of the ability. The Superior version of Command Frequency is unlocked through the Temporal Operative Recruitment event. Unfortunately, the rest of these starship traits aren't going to be nearly as effective as spawning in additional Odyssey-class ships as Superior Command Frequency is going to be. The next trait is Heard I Needed Help off of the legendary Kelvin Constitution. When your hull is below 50%, using a hull heal or an Intel Bridge Officer ability will summon in the Kelvin Timeline version of your ship that will assist you for 60 seconds. In addition to firing its weapons, it'll also be able to use the abilities Construction Shuttle Wing, Delayed Overload Cascade, and Augmented Boarding Party. Unfortunately, this starship trait also has a 2-minute recharge time. So assuming you're even able to activate it in the first place, because this does require you to be at 50% hull, you're still not going to get much use out of it, because 2 minutes is a long time in a TFO. But this will summon in a Kelvin version of your ship, meaning that it'll basically just copy your ship's costume and apply the Kelvin hull material on it. Sadly, there isn't much else to pick from that'll fit the theme of this build, so this stays because there really aren't a lot of other better options. And pretty much all of those other options are already on the build. Next is It's Another Enterprise from the Titan Science Destroyer. Using Engineering, Tactical, or Science Fleet will summon in one of your faction's flagships that will join you in combat for 90 seconds. So for Federation characters, that'll be any variant of the Odyssey class. Oh, this actually reminds me, and I really should have brought this up sooner, while I'm using this build to spawn in as many Odyssey class ships as I can, you could do this for any of the flagships for all 4 factions, just as long as you're playing on that faction. So KDF players could do this for the Bortosk, Romulans could do this for the Scimitar, and Jem'Hadar players could do this for... what's their flagship? I think it's the Jem'Hadar Vanguard Dreadnought. Anyway, the next starship trait is Photonic Diversion off the Damar Intel Science Dreadnought. With this trait, when I activate Jam Targeting Sensors, which I already have on the build to trigger unconventional systems, or evade target lock, this will create a photonic decoy near your target's location. This decoy will attack with Spiral Wave Disruptor Beam Arrays and Photon Torpedoes and have a constant feedback pulse effect active. Not that that feedback pulse is going to do anything, because only enemy NPCs are allowed to have the good feedback pulse. Players and friendly NPCs, they just get crappy feedback pulse, which just tickles the enemy. But that photonic decoy does copy your ship's costume, so it's another Odyssey on the field. And it'll stay active for 20 seconds and can be triggered once every 30 seconds. Now, the fact that this last trait is here really shows you I was really scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to find starship traits that fit the theme for this build. Because this is Black Alert, which originally released with the Crossfield Science Spearhead. And I hate this starship trait with a fiery passion due to its absolutely pitiful performance. Seriously, in the parse that I'm going to show you later, this thing did 123 DPS. That's it. Seriously, the Barclay maneuver did more damage than this pathetic trait. Okay, so what this piece of crap does is every time you activate Beam Overload, Cannon Rapid Fire, or an Intel Bridge Officer ability, it will create spore duplicates of your ship. You'll get up to 4 spawns of these duplicates every 3 seconds over the course of the next 12 seconds. Every time one spawns, it'll fire off a small torpedo salvo that'll hit up to 2 enemies and deal a small amount of kinetic damage, and I do mean small, and once that 12 seconds is up, it'll be locked out for 25 seconds. But those spore duplicates will copy your ship's costume, so that is more Odyssey-class ships on the board, technically. Of the 5 starship traits that I'm using to spawn in additional Odyssey-class ships, this is the only one that won't spawn in an independent NPC. The spore duplicates are more like a weapon or a console effect than anything else. They just pop in, fire off their torpedo spreads, and then pop right back out. Now, there is one other starship trait that I think would have actually fit in better, because I'm pretty sure that one actually spawns in an independent NPC. It's called Temporal Ally. When you receive damage on a shield facing that is critically low or depleted, it'll summon in a Temporal Ally for 30 seconds, which will fight alongside you, and make you immune to damage for 3 seconds, but will then have a lockout time of 90 seconds, which isn't great, but still manages to be better than Hurt I Need Help. Now, I didn't use this trait because it comes off of an old lockbox ship that I don't own, the Nakul Akaros Battlecruiser. So getting my hands on one of these ships would have been a huge, expensive pain in the butt, and also I wasn't entirely sure how worth it the trait would be because I've never actually seen anyone actually use it. I don't know if the Temporal Ally it summons is actually a copy of your ship, or if it's actually just another ship. I mean, it could be another Akaros for all I know. And because of that damage immunity effect, it sounds like it could be functioning kind of like the Nakul Ground Shield, meaning even if it does summon in another Odyssey, it's going to have that annoying red, glowy, transparent effect on it, which I wouldn't want. Actually, speaking of the Nakul ships, the Nakul Science Vessel has a console that sounds like it has a similar effect. Temporal Distress Beacon, and actually one of the members of the channel actually gave me one of these things, and then we both found out that the console is bound to Nakul ships only, so I can't use it on this build, which was very annoying to find out. Now, if you're less concerned with spawning in flagships and more with just spawning in independent NPC ships, then there is one more option for you. Need to Know Basis. With this starship trait, every time you use an ensign level bridge officer ability, you will gain a stack of Need to Know Basis. Once you hit a stack of 10, they will be removed, and you will spawn in a Section 31 ship, which will fight alongside you for 31 seconds. Need to Know Basis is from the Infinity lockboxes, but it's not attached to a starship, so you can get it pretty cheap on the exchange. Okay, so none of my bridge officers or my duty officers are contributing anything to spawning in additional Odyssey-class ships, so we're going to go right ahead to the parse. $243 DPS. It's an impressive number, but honestly it really doesn't matter in this case. Because remember what I said earlier, the theme of this build can be applied to pretty much any sort of build. So we're going to go into the player analysis and pay attention to the things that were specifically added for this theme. You can see the pets did the most damage with 53k DPS. The Valkyrie pets did do the most damage, which is actually a little impressive considering I wasn't even using Superior Area Denial or Independent Wingmate, though it's really not that impressive when you look at the performance of all the other pets. USS Enterprise, that's the one that spawned in from the flagship transponder, and that actually did 10k, which is more than I would have expected, honestly. Though the reason the Enterprise's DPS is so much higher than, say, the other battlecruisers or the other Odyssey-class ships is because it was spawned in first. Therefore, it had more time to do more damage per second. That's kind of the key behind this whole build. Each of these ships that I'm spawning in really aren't that powerful. In fact, they're actually pretty weak. But if you can spawn enough of them quick enough and get them to stay alive for long enough, then that can add up to some pretty reasonable DPS. Though it certainly helps if you're applying this theme to a build that you know already does rather well. You can see here the Hydra did 25k. Like I said, it didn't do exactly what I was hoping it would do, but at the same time, 25k is still pretty good for a console. Now, these high-yield tricobalt explosions, those are actually coming from the Odyssey pets, or at least I know from the Enterprise. I don't know if the other Odysseys fire tricobalts, but I know the Enterprise can, so I don't really know why that damage is showing up under my listing and not under the pet damage. It might be because the tricobalts are a destructible torpedo, and once it launches from the Enterprise, it's probably considered its own entity, and that's why it's being put under my damage. And down here, way at the bottom, you can see Black Alert damage, which did 123.88 damage per second. I know this trait technically does add more Odysseys to the build, but honestly, I really don't think it's worth it. I really should just swap this out for something more practical, because that is just absolutely horrible. Seriously, that's a whole Starship trait slot that I'm only getting 123 damage per second out of. That's unacceptable. The fact that someone made this Starship trait, saw how little damage it did, and went, yeah, that's good enough. God, it makes me irrationally upset. And this is not a cheap trait. This was originally introduced on a lockbox ship, the Crossfield, and was then later added to the Legendary Crossfield, but that's also only available in the 10th Anniversary Bundle, which again is very expensive. Anyway, final thoughts. Odyssey-class. Odyssey-class good. Need more Odyssey-class. Yeah, that'll do. So yeah, there is my attempt to get as many Odysseys onto one map as I possibly can. Like I said, there are a couple more things I could have done to add a few more there, but at the same time, some of them were just really expensive and I don't have them, and other options were just not overall practical for the actual build itself. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it, though I do still want to come up with a replacement for Black Alert, because, God, that trait is terrible. It's so bad. Anyway, be sure to let me know what you thought of the build down below in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to like and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. If you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or hit the super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store in the video's description. If you're ever shopping at the Epic Games Store, which, speaking of, Star Trek Resurgence is 40% off right now, so if you haven't picked that up, go pick that up. But yeah, if you're ever shopping at the Epic Games Store, be sure to use my content creator code STU1701. Doesn't cost you anything extra, but it does help me out, and I do appreciate that. That is Epic content creator code STU1701. Either way, though, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.